This is a quiet voice. Tonight, I want to tell you about a man who built his entire life around fire, and what happened the moment his hands began to fail him. The workshop sat where the pavement turned to dust, the air inside thick with bone-deep heat. Jonah was a master glassblower who spent 50 years turning molten silica into light-catching forms. He lived by the rhythm of the furnace, a beast that demanded constant feeding. Facing the heat alone for a decade, convinced solitude kept his focus sharp. His hands were his most precious tools, large and scarred from years of burns and cuts. But lately they had begun to betray him in small, terrifying ways that he tried to hide from the few customers who still came to his door. There was a tremor, a slight shake in his left thumb that appeared whenever he was tired or stressed, a tiny rebellion of the nerves that threatened to ruin everything he touched. Glass blowing allows no hesitation, and Jonah knew that this piece would expose whatever weakness he was trying to hide. On this particular Tuesday, the rain was hammering against the tin roof, a rhythmic drumming that usually calmed him. But today it only added to the tension in his chest, because he was attempting something he had failed at 3 times before. He wanted to create a double helix vessel, a complex shape that required 2 colors of glass to twist around each other without touching, a test of skill that would prove to himself that he was not done yet, that he still had the mastery he was known for. He gathered the molten glass on the end of the blowpipe, the orange glow lighting up his wrinkled face, and he moved to the marver, the steel table where he would roll the glass to shape it. But just as he began to turn the pipe, the bell above the workshop door jingled. Jonah did not look up, for looking up meant stopping the rotation, and stopping the rotation meant losing the piece. So he kept his eyes locked on the glowing orb at the end of his pipe, shouting over the roar of the furnace that the shop was closed. He expected the sound of the door closing, the retreat of a confused tourist or a lost driver. But instead, he heard the heavy thud of a wet coat being dropped onto the wooden bench near the entrance. The footsteps that followed were not hesitant. They were the confident, measured steps of someone who knew that a glassblower cannot be interrupted in the middle of a gather. And the stranger waited in silence while Jonah finished the initial shape and placed the pipe back into the glory hole to reheat. When he finally turned around, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a rag that was more soot than cotton, he saw a woman standing there, shaking the rain from a long dark umbrella, looking at him with eyes that felt uncomfortably familiar. She was perhaps 40 years old, dressed in practical clothes that spoke of work rather than leisure, and she held herself with a stillness that contrasted sharply with the storm raging outside the thin windows. Jonah asked her what she wanted, his voice rough from the smoke and the silence of his days, and she simply replied that her name was Sarah, and that she had come to return something that belonged to him, something her father had kept in his garage for 30 years. The name hit Jonah like a physical blow. Her father was Marcus, his former partner, and the man who once stood beside him at this very bench. They were brothers until a bitter argument, art versus mass production, tore them apart 3 decades ago. Jonah looked at the battered crate, feeling a surge of old anger mixed with sharp grief. He knew Marcus had passed away last winter. Sarah did not apologize for her presence or for the memories she had dragged in with the rain. She simply opened the box and revealed a set of jacks, the steel blades used to shape the neck of a vase, that Jonah had made himself 40 years ago. She told him that Marcus had used these tools every day until he couldn't work anymore, that he had never bought a new pair because he said nothing else felt right in his hand, and she pushed the box toward him across the scarred table. Jonah wanted to tell her to take them away, to tell her that he didn't need charity or ghosts in his workshop, but his hands were trembling again, and he quickly hid them behind his back, hoping she hadn't noticed the weakness that was slowly taking away the work that defined his life. She noticed, of course, because she was a glassblower's daughter, and she knew the signs of fatigue and nerve damage better than any doctor, having watched her own father fade in the same slow, heartbreaking way. She didn't say a word about his hands, but she didn't leave either. Instead, she walked over to the annealing oven, checking the temperature gauge with a familiarity that annoyed Jonah. He turned back to the furnace, hoping the heat would send her away. But when he looked back, she was still there. He tried to ignore her, dipping the pipe into the crucible. He gathered the molten glass, moving to the bench to begin the complex twist. He needed to be perfect, to prove he didn't need her pity. But as he lifted the pipe, his left thumb twitched violently. The pipe dipped. In glass blowing, the smallest deviation becomes permanent. The hot glass slumped, the delicate balance ruined, collapsing into a lopsided lump. Jonah cursed and let the pipe drop to the rails of the bench, the failure stinging more than the heat, and he waited for her to speak, to offer some platitude or some advice he didn't want. But Sarah didn't speak. She stepped forward, picked up a wet block of wood used for shaping, and held it out to him, her face calm and devoid of judgment, offering him a chance to save the piece rather than mocking him for ruining it. Jonah stared at the wood block in her hand, his pride warring with his desperation, knowing that if he didn't reshape the glass in the next 10 seconds, it would cool too much and crack, shattering on the floor like his ego. He took the block, his hand brushing hers, and he saw calluses on her palms, the hard, thick skin of someone who worked with their hands, and he realized with a jolt that she wasn't just an observer. He went back to the glory hole, reheating the glass, and when he returned to the bench, she was already sitting on the opposite side, picking up the jacks he had abandoned, ready to help him shape the neck, while he turned the pipe. He wanted to shout at her to stop, to tell her that he worked alone, but the glass was hot and ready, and he had no choice but to sit and roll the pipe, watching as she applied the steel blades to the molten material. She moved with a grace that he remembered, a rhythm that was eerie in its familiarity, for she moved exactly the way Marcus had moved, with the same efficient, gentle pressure that coaxed the glass rather than forcing it. For 20 minutes, they didn't speak a word, communicating only through the groans of the metal bench and the hiss of steam as wet wood touched hot glass, a silent dance of creation that Jonah hadn't performed with another person in 30 years. When the piece was finally done, a perfect helix of clear glass that caught the light of the furnace, Jonah carried it to the annealing oven, the large kiln where the glass would cool down slowly through the long, quiet night. This was the most dangerous moment of all, because glass remembers stress, and if it cools too fast, it doesn't just crack, it holds the tension until it fails. He closed the heavy door of the oven and latched it, feeling the immense relief that comes when a piece is safely put away, and he turned to find Sarah washing her hands in the sink, the soot and grime swirling down the drain. He asked her, his voice quieter now, why she had learned the trade, assuming she had become a lawyer or an accountant like Marcus had wanted for her. She dried her hands on a rough towel and told him that she had tried to leave the life, but the fire was in her blood, and after Marcus died, she couldn't bear to let his knowledge disappear. So she had taken over his small studio in the next county. Jonah made tea on a hot plate in the corner, the simple domestic task bridging the gap between them, and as the rain began to soften on the roof, they sat on 2 stools near the warmth of the furnace walls. She told him that Marcus had talked about him often, not with anger, but with a strange sort of regret, admitting that he had been too stubborn to see that Jonah was right about the art, even if Jonah had been wrong about the money. It was a peace offering, delivered 3 decades late. But as Jonah looked at the woman who carried his old friend's eyes, he felt the hard knot in his chest, the one he had carried since the day Marcus left, begin to loosen. He confessed to her about his hands, about the fear that woke him up at 3 in the morning, the terror of losing the only thing that gave his life meaning and identity. He expected her to tell him to retire, to sell the shop and move to a condo in the city, but instead, she nodded and told him about a Japanese potter she knew who had lost his sight, but still threw pots by feel. She said that the glass didn't care if his hands shook. It only cared if he respected the heat, and that maybe he just needed 4 hands instead of 2, suggesting a partnership he hadn't dared to consider. The suggestion hung in the air, heavy and frightening, because Jonah had defined himself by his independence for so long that the idea of sharing his space felt like a surrender. But he looked at the annealing oven, thinking about the science of stress, how glass that is too rigid, too tense, is the most fragile thing in the world, liable to break at the slightest shock. He realized that he was like a piece of unannealed glass, holding on to 30 years of tension and pride, and if he didn't find a way to cool down, to let go of the stress gradually, he would fail under pressure just as surely as a dropped vase. Sarah stood up to leave, buttoning her coat against the damp chill near the door, telling him that she would come back next week to pick up the box if he didn't want the tools. She didn't push him for an answer, didn't demand a decision, giving him the space he needed, just as the oven gave the glass the time it needed to stabilize. Jonah walked her to the door, the gravel crunching under his boots, and as she opened the umbrella, he asked her if she knew how to make a specialized stopper for the helix vase, a technique that was notoriously difficult. She smiled, a small, knowing expression that lit up her face, and said that she had never mastered it, but she knew the theory, and she would be willing to learn if he was willing to teach. It wasn't a promise of a partnership, not yet, but it was an open door, a possibility that hung between them like a bridge over the decades of silence. Jonah watched her walk to her car, the red taillights fading into the mist, and for the first time in years, the solitude of the workshop didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like an empty room waiting to be filled. He went back inside and sat in front of the annealing oven, listening to the hum of the electric coils that were slowly, degree by degree, bringing the glass down to room temperature. He thought about Marcus, about the argument that had seemed so important back then, a fight over a contract that neither of them even remembered the details of, and how foolish it seemed now in the light of the fire. He picked up the old jacks from the box, the steel smooth and worn from Marcus's hands, and he felt the weight of the legacy that had been passed back to him, a circle closing. The next morning, Jonah woke up with a clarity he hadn't felt in months, the rain having washed the world clean, leaving the sky a brilliant, pale blue. He went to the shop early, hours before he usually started, and began to clean the windows, scrubbing away the grime of years to let the light pour in. He wasn't sure if Sarah would actually come back, or if he was ready to share his kingdom, but he knew he had to prepare the space for something new, something that wasn't just about him and his fading skills. When he opened the annealing oven to check the helix vase, he held his breath, a habit born of 1,000 disappointments, praying that the thermal shock hadn't cracked the piece during the night. He lifted it out with gloved hands, holding it up to the sunlight streaming through the clean window, and saw that it was perfect, the twist of the glass seamless and strong. It was the best thing he had made in 5 years, and he knew, with a sudden, humble certainty, that he could not have made it without the pair of hands that had stepped in when his own had failed. He placed the vase on the display shelf, right in the center, and then he went to the phone, a dusty rotary dial that sat on a desk piled high with invoices and sketches. He stared at it for a long time, his finger hovering over the dial, the old fear of rejection whispering to him that it was too late, that people don't change, that he was too old to start over. But then he looked at the tools on the bench, the ones Marcus had kept for 30 years, and he realized that keeping them was a form of hope, a sign that his friend had never truly let go either. He dialed the number Sarah had left on a scrap of paper, his heart beating a little faster, the sound of the ringtone echoing in the quiet shop. When she answered, her voice was professional and guarded, expecting a customer or a bill collector, and Jonah found himself stumbling over the words, his throat tight. He simply told her that the vase had survived the annealing, that it was whole and sound, and that he had been thinking about the stopper she mentioned. There was a silence on the other end, a pause that stretched out, and Jonah worried he had misread the situation, that her offer had been merely polite. Then he heard her exhale, a sound of relief, and she asked him what time he started the fire in the morning, her voice warmer than before. He told her 5 a.m., the hour when the world is still dark and the furnace glows brightest, and she said she would be there at 5:15, provided he had fresh coffee ready. Jonah hung up the phone and sat back in his chair, looking around the workshop that suddenly seemed different, less like a fortress and more like a classroom. He realized that redemption wasn't a grand event, a burst of trumpets, or a sudden fix for all his mistakes. It was just a series of small choices, like cooling glass, degree by degree. It was the choice to open a door, to accept help, to admit that the cracks in our lives don't mean we are broken, only that we have been under pressure. He spent the rest of the day organizing the bench, making space on the left side for another person, moving his tools to share the area he had guarded so jealously. He felt a sadness for the years lost with Marcus, a grief that would always be there, but it was a clean grief now, not the festering wound it had been. He understood now that strength means nothing when stress has nowhere to go. That evening, as he shut down the lights and banked the fire for the night, Jonah looked at his hands one last time. They still shook, a faint tremor that wouldn't go away. But he didn't look at them with fear anymore. He looked at them with gratitude for what they had done. He knew that tomorrow there would be another pair of hands to steady the work, another set of eyes to watch the fire, and that together they might make something that neither could make alone. The shop went dark, save for the orange glow of the furnace pilot, a heartbeat that would keep the heat alive until morning came. Jonah walked out into the cool night air, locking the door behind him. But for the first time in a decade, he didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness following him home. He felt light, like the glass before it hardens, ready to be shaped into something new, something that would catch the light and hold it. This is a quiet voice, and sometimes the quietest choice is simply allowing someone else to stand beside us.